During the fall season, I was driving back to school. It was almost a 10-hour-long drive, and I had made up my mind that I was doing it all in one go. I knew that it was never going to be easy. Not being a regular driver, I thought it would be fun 10 hours of driving because I was aware that there was a lot of middle of nowhere and had a bunch of teeny tiny towns on this route. The start of the ride was wonderful. I was energetic, covering the distance at a good pace, and did not face any sort of trouble at all. After a few hours, I really had to pee, and there hadn't been any towns for quite a while. I think I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, so I did not dare to stop my vehicle. I mean, you'd never know what's waiting for you at such places. I kept driving, and finally, there was one of those freeway signs with food, gas, and lodging listed, just near the next exit. I had been driving nonstop for probably 7 hours at this point. The sign said that there was a gas station and a fast food restaurant too. Now I was sure that those places have bathrooms too, so I took the exit. Generally, those signs mean that there is something right off the freeway, but I ended up following the signs for several miles and finally saw the fast food restaurant. I had lost the track of time and just noticed that it was just starting to get dark. As I pulled into the parking lot, this little kid runs in front of my car, but I'm going slowly enough not to hit it. The entire parking lot was empty, and there wasn't much around it, mostly just trees. I get out of the car and try to see where the kid went, but I couldn't spot him anywhere. Now I was hardly managing to control my urge to pee. And more than anything else, the kid didn't seem to be lost. He just looked like those kids of carefree parents who let their children run off around the area. So I rushed inside the place to relieve my bladder. Once I got out, I was greeted by the bartender, and he asked me about my whereabouts. That's when I remembered the kid again. I looked around, and there was literally no one inside the hotel. In fact, the lights too were dimmed. I turned around to ask him if there were any couples lodging inside the hotel, as I had seen a kid out there. He laughed and asked me to ignore it. I shrugged and went outside to my vehicle and got inside it. I turned the engine on, made sure that everything was set, and started my ride. As I pulled my vehicle out of the parking spot, I noticed that the place had no lights at all. And by no lights, I mean no lights even on the inside, because it was abandoned. It looked like the ruins of a building that wasn't used for years maybe. I was dumbfounded because I had just entered and done my business. So how was that even possible? My mind immediately flashed the memory of my colleague warning me about the route. He had told me that I was going to travel across certain places that would make me go insane. So it was best to not stop and instead keep driving. It might be psychological, but either a cool breeze blew past or I randomly had a chill run down my spine. I decided to not think, but focus on my route. The exit of the parking lot was near, so I drove towards it. And when I almost got there, I saw through the mirror that the bartender was chasing behind my car. I knew I was hallucinating, but I drove even faster and exited the haunted place. I did not even bother to refuel my car at the gas station. I had a tough time navigating back to my route since I had taken an exit to get to this place. After a few minutes of driving in the middle of nowhere, I managed to get back on track. I reached home an hour or two later. The next day, I told my friend about it. He said that he has been taking that route for years now, and he never came across such a gas station or a hotel. I checked the map and there was nothing there either. The next time I had to use that route, I kept an eye out for the signboard, but to my surprise, there wasn't one. I typed about this on Reddit, but to no avail. It seemed as if I was in some other parallel universe where that place exists. I checked with some locals near that spot, and they claim that sometimes drivers do end up going there, asking for directions to the hotel, but they have never seen those vehicles return. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Sometime around the September of 2011, I was driving to visit my sister who lives in Missouri. It had gotten pretty late, and I admit that I was a bit tired, but not to an extent where I should have pulled over to a hotel for resting. So I continued driving, ignoring the slight fatigue, and I got to this stretch of road where it was just cornfields on either side of me. This was before Google Maps was popular, so I had been given the directions on a map. I checked the route on the map and it showed that I had to continue driving straight and then take the next left. I drove straight and straight until I got a little nervous. I mean, the piece of the map had a left turn considerably sooner than what I had driven, and there were no lefts on the cornfield road, but multiple rights. And every now and again, I did come across a left, but it was a small man-made road that simply wasn't big enough for my car. I started getting a bit confused about where I was supposed to turn, because I'd been driving straight for about 35 minutes or so, and there was still no left turn in sight. I passed a left turn that was big enough for my car, but it was a dirt road. I figured that was probably the turn I was supposed to make. I took the turn and ended up driving around a damn cornfield paved road maze. I ended up lost for about 2 hours before I finally found the small dirt road again. I drove up and found myself at a house. Until that point, I was confident that was obviously not the correct left turn, so I threw my vehicle in reverse and went to leave when I saw some light and noticed some movement within my peripheral vision. I looked over to that side, and it was just a large group of people, maybe over 7, standing around a fire and coming in my direction. I froze for a moment. They were still significantly distant, but they were covering ground at a good pace. No matter how happy I was looking at humans after hours of being lost, it took me a while to realize that they weren't coming to help me. In fact, their faces, which were lit up by the fire, suggested the exact opposite. It was already in the middle of the night, maybe around 2:30 a.m., and I was lost in a cornfield maze. I had been driving in a maze for about 1.5 hours. I was tired and I had enough for one night, so I drove off. I got lost again and ended up driving for about an hour in the wrong direction, found a gas station, waited for morning, and rang my sister to help me find where the hell she lived. As you can tell, this was before cell phones and GPS became super prevalent, and I have tremendous appreciation for the advancement in technology. Before Google Maps, finding routes was not just difficult, it was dangerous. I am a fan of driving in the night, and because of that, I have experienced some chilling encounters. Some were really scary, but only if you were on the driver's seat like me. And they might not sound as scary if I just told you about them. However, I have a couple of stories that might spook you. The first one is when I was driving to my friend's ranch for a New Year's Eve party. This was somewhere down in Eagle Pass, near the Texas-Mexico border. It was pouring heavily that day, and I was slowly driving down on a back road with my high beams on. The visibility was poor, and I was having a difficult time looking at the road ahead when something jumped in front of my truck, paused for a mere second or two, and then darted back into the woods. I guess it was about 2 to 3 feet tall, white, and briefly stood on 2 legs. For a Lord of the Rings fan like me, I was assured that Gollum lived somewhere in South Texas. But jokes apart, that sudden appearance simply freaked me out as I was driving alone at night. And to this date, I'm still not sure as to what creature it was. My second creepy encounter was when I came across an abandoned and torn tent in the outback of Australia. I was out with my friends. We were on a road trip up the west coast of Australia, and we took a little detour inland near Carnarvon. We wanted to see the red sands and other such things unique to that place. So we drove and went down a dirt road, but there was nothing for miles, and that made us a little uncomfortable. After some 15 to 20 minutes of driving, we found a tent. We hesitantly approached it and saw that it had been torn open on one side. There was a filthy pillow and some clothes were scattered inside of it. Some shit had happened on the inside, but the tent was still firmly staked down. And it looked like it had been there a while. I just hoped that both the individuals who were supposedly living in the tent made it home safe. Again, I'm aware that this might not sound as creepy to you, but the sheer sight of one tent in a vast endless expanse was creepy, let alone the condition of items on the inside of it. Thus reminds me of another incident. This happened somewhere back home in Texas, out near Enchanted Rock. We had driven to a point and decided to hang out there for a while until we decided to drive back home. It was super late, but we were in our 20s and full of energy. We got there, and I was walking around the woods with some friends and exploring the area when we nearly stumbled into a pit. And it was no ordinary pit. This was full of rattlesnakes. I don't know if you've ever seen a snake den, but they tend to ball up into a horrifying Lovecraftian nightmare. I clicked pictures of this sight. It was creepy as hell. And I thank all my lucky stars that I did not fall into that pit. Else I might not have been here to tell you about my encounter. I was driving alone across the country on the Interstate Highway 10. Now I don't remember the precise location, but I was somewhere in the middle of the desert. My car's indicator suggested that I only had about 15 miles left in gas. So I pulled off to the very first gas station that I'd seen for the last hour. Now, since I was a considerably young driver and a woman, I had made a rule for myself that any time I stopped for gas, I would only pay at the pump and would never leave my car or go anywhere inside, apart from the hotels where I stayed at. So I swiped my card, and as it was processing the payment, the transaction got canceled and it prompted me to see the cashier. I tried again, and halfway through typing in my code, it got canceled and told me again to see the cashier. I looked towards the convenience store in front of me and saw that it had broken windows, was boarded up, and was completely abandoned. Even the tall station sign on the top was torn apart. I did spot someone on the inside of the store, peering at me from between the boards. And the very second when I saw them, they jumped out of my view. They clearly didn't want to be seen by me, but they kept trying to get me to come into the abandoned station by canceling the transaction. But no, I was too smart to fall for this trap. So I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Just as I was about to leave, I got an SMS from an unknown number. It read something like, "You have spent $400 via your credit card." I panicked for a moment and then decided to head to the cashier to fire him. I mean, he couldn't just scam me of my money and expect to get away with it just because I was a girl. I stepped out of my car and started walking towards the store. I did not want to fight with him, but simply wanted my money back. As I reached the door and struggled to open it, I heard someone whisper inside. It wasn't so clear, but it was something like,
"No! Not yet! Let her get in first!"
As soon as I heard it, I froze. The realization hit me that the cashier wasn't alone inside. And worse, they wanted me to enter the store. Immediately, I bolted in the opposite direction. I heard the door squeak open behind me and footsteps chasing me. But somehow I managed to get inside the car. I started the car and by some miracle made it to the next station, which was almost 25 miles away. I used to drive trucks for a big company whose product delivery was always required to be done at nighttime. So I generally started my drive at 3 a.m. I had to drive to a few remote stores in little towns surrounding the town where my company was situated. I was about halfway through the 40-mile drive to the next town. Now, since it was past 3 a.m., it was dark out there, and there were no houses around for a long way in any direction. I looked on the side of the road ahead of me and saw a backhoe over there, which was odd in itself. Then I noticed that his bucket was extremely high, and as I was getting closer, I realized that he was gutting a buffalo that was hanging from the bucket. Now I have happened to have grown up around ranching, so I wasn't too freaked out by the sight of it. So for some reason, I decided to slow down and see if this guy needed any sort of help. I know I simply can't explain or justify this decision of mine, but it is what I did at that spur of the moment. But when I stopped next to him, he just smiled and waved at me. So I did the same thing and asked, "Need a hand?" He heard me say it and he just cracked up laughing. And it was no ordinary laugh. He was like hysterically laughing and constantly knee-slapping laughing. For some reason, I too started laughing, and so now we were two guys cracking up laughing. One was covered in blood, while the other with a truck full of bread. Gradually, the reality of this situation made its way into my sleep-deprived brain, and I hit the gas and got out of there as soon as I could. I thought about it and realized that this guy drove a tractor into the middle of nowhere to simply kill someone else's cattle. Or he was probably poaching this thing, and he was just going to load the thing into the front bucket and drive the shit back to his house at 3 a.m. Who knows how far away he had to drive that thing? I had no idea what the hell was happening, but the whole thing was pretty creepy. This one time I was at a wedding in a little prairie village that was about 100 or 120 miles away from my city. I had packed everything up once things wound down, and I was the last one to leave from the venue at 2:30 a.m. I got off the place and started to drive toward the highway, and that's when saw a big orange glow emanating from the other side of a ridge and on the other side of the railway tracks. I was a little curious, so I decided to check it out as it was so perfectly even and smooth. I had never ever seen a light like that before. I was thinking that it might be some huge bonfire for the weddings after the party. I had to drive up 2 or 3 miles to cross the tracks and crest the ridge. Once I did that, the light was still off on the horizon. I drove toward it for a few more miles, but it didn't seem to be getting any nearer. I decided that it wasn't a bonfire, and I didn't want to get myself into any sort of trouble, so I turned around and decided to head back to the city. I could still see the light in the back, but I kept driving. Almost 40 miles later, I got to the main highway, so I decided to look back again, and the light was just as big in the sky as it was back in the village. I looked at the news the next day and found out what had happened. A few underground natural gas storage tanks had ruptured and combusted, which caused a massive fire. It got to a point where there was no option but to let it burn until it ran out of fuel. It continued burning and ended up burning for 5 or 6 days. I would have been okay had I drove on to see the fire, but probably would have panicked upon seeing it. I might have assumed it to be a Chernobyl-like situation by the sight of it. So it was just as well that I didn't. It was very weird and ethereal seeing that massive light. I mean, it had such a quiet might to it, and it was drawing me to it like a moth. When I was a kid, I used to go on road trips with my family. My dad used to drive us to these random off-the-map places. He always loved driving and was passionate about night drives. So one day, my family and I were driving through the mountains. The route was a dirt road, and it was giving us the chills. I mean, apart from the chilly weather, there was a different vibe to this place. I just shrugged it off as my anxiety about going to a new unknown place, and that too at night. So we parked the car after reaching a spot where our semi-truck couldn't fit further. We got down and then walked a little ahead. We got to a small clearing at the dead end of the dirt road and saw a blue convertible with its doors open. My dad was a car enthusiast, and so he was like,
Wait, guys! Let's check this out!
He walked around the car for a few seconds, and then immediately turned and started speed walking back to us. He didn't even look at us, just ordered us to hurry. I was a little curious, so I started to walk over to the car and saw several bullet holes in the doors and blood on the seats. I ran back and said, "Dad, what happened?" And he said,
I don't know, but the hood was still warm.
We rushed back to the car, turned it around in a hurry, and gunned for home before anyone could spot us. But we were unfortunate, as we heard a car in the distance. And someone even shouted and demanded us to stop. I think we were too loud, and the silent woods would have amplified our noise. We did hear the engine in the distance for almost half an hour. The good thing was that we were getting farther in distance. After a point, we even heard another gunshot coming from the back. I mean, I know it could have been anyone, and also a cop. But we did not stop because had it been the killer who murdered the person in that blue convertible car, we too would have ended up murdered. The memory still haunts me and gives me chills.